Hello, this is the third in our Deep Questions series. And the question I've been asked to look at this morning is, how do we make sense of a world where there's so much suffering? Because the reality is there is lots of suffering in the world. We know that there is also kindness and compassion and generosity and beauty in the world. And this is the puzzle of the presence of evil. Jesus once told a parable, and I don't pretend it tells the whole story, but it's one of a series of windows on this issue, which I think helps us, about some wheat and some weeds. And in dealing with this issue, I feel like we can't define how to deal with it, but we can do some kind of thinking around the edges. So Jesus told this story about the wheat and the weeds, and it's in Matthew chapter 13, and I'll just read it. Then Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed ears, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants came to him and said, "Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from?" "An enemy did this," he replied. The servants asked him, "Do you want us to go and pull them up?" "No," he answered, "because while you're pulling up the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At that time I'll tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burnt. Then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn." Jesus told the story primarily to help us think about how we live in a world where not everybody is good all the time. But I think the principle covers the whole area of suffering and things that are wrong in life generally. And the story tells us a number of things. The first thing is it acknowledges the presence, the reality of things that are wrong. It acknowledges it in human hearts, and it acknowledges it in the world and the created order at large. And it acknowledges that there's a spiritual conflict with an enemy to the plans of God. So it's real. But then the story says something about God's apparent inability to intervene. He doesn't do anything immediately. He says we've got to wait. These two have got to live together. And this is a picture that comes up in a story like the story of Noah's flood, where God tried to eradicate all that was wrong in the world, but then found that he couldn't do it, and he had to live with the reality of good and evil together, of beauty and awfulness alongside one another. But then the story talks about a final reckoning, that those wrong things will be dealt with. Injustice and evil will not go on forever. God's love cannot permit misdeeds to be shoved under the carpet and overlooked. Perfection will come, but not without a reckoning for what is wrong. And what does the Bible say about responding to suffering? Well, just a quick sweep tells me that Jesus taught us that we must weep with those who weep. We come alongside those who are suffering. It says we should overcome evil with good. That's the way we're supposed to live. God has a heart for justice, and he calls us to be like him, to stand up, to see justice done. He calls us to pray, and sometimes just to live with the awful situation that we have to leave it with God's hand to deal with in his time. And then lastly, we're taught to choose forgiveness and gratitude over bitterness and self-pity. Now that's a big issue. But I wish somebody like Kim Phuc, the 9-year-old Vietnamese girl caught in the horror of a mistaken bombing with napalm towards the end of the Vietnamese War, was here to speak for me. You will probably have seen her photograph. She suffered horrific burns and survived months of painful skin grafts. But she found hope in becoming a Christian when she was 19. She's now a UN ambassador, speaking of the need to choose forgiveness rather than bitterness. And the last thing I'll say is that we have a God who knows us, understands our suffering, and is with us in it. There's huge power in somebody coming alongside us who's shared the awful experience that we're going through. And Jesus on the cross entered into the worst of human suffering. But the story is that he didn't just enter into it, he actually broke it. And he dealt with the spiritual enemy, and he dealt with all that was wrong. And he rose from the dead to offer hope to everyone by his presence with us, even in the most profound suffering. This is Jesus who is risen and alongside us and able to give us hope in the future. Someone once asked me, which did I think was worse? A world of suffering where there's no God and nothing makes any sense? Or a world of suffering with a God of compassion and love who weeps with us, works with us to overcome all that's wrong, and will set everything right eventually? I chose that second one. Thanks for listening. I hope that helps. Do get in touch if you want to talk these things through, and God bless you today.